If you can't get rid of a risk or get risk down to the level you need to get them to, then residual risk is going to exist that you need to manage. And here's where you have to bring in an external party. This is risk financing. The most common approach we think to risk financing for us as individuals is insurance, where we buy auto insurance, homeowners insurance, life insurance. Those ways we can bring in a third party, an insurance company, to help control those risks. There's other types of risk financing, captive insurance companies, risk securitization, letters of credit. These are all specialized that we might get in a few of them, but I doubt we'll get into too much detail in this class. But all are ways, especially the corporations, try to bring in third parties to help them in some way. At the very end, if you just cannot manage the risk where you want to, then you have risk retention. You just keep the risk yourself. But the goal here is to understand that what we're trying to do is not minimize risk, but we're trying to practice risk optimization. That is, we want to take on those risks for which we have expertise, where we're getting adequately paid, and then reduce or limit those risks for which we're not getting adequately paid or which we don't have expertise. We don't want to do risk minimization, which is, the goal is just to get risk down to zero. That's what credit rating agencies and regulators are looking for. But our goal is actually to take the risk we know better than others and get paid for taking that risk. So let's get into some of the quantification of this. And when we do risk identification, measurement, and control, we're going to use another format that's very similar to it, and that is define, measure, mitigate. Define the risk. Up here we call that risk identification and risk analysis. We're then going to measure the risk. That's in terms of frequency and severity. And then we're going to mitigate the risk, either by using loss control or transfer. A common approach to risk identification is a universe of risk. It's a list of risks that a firm is interested in managing, to keep them in different categories. We went to CMRA's site, and you can go to these sites. CMRA actually has what they call a galaxy of risk, which lists all the risks that they think through. It's a fairly comprehensive, extensive list. We're going to be working with this list, a shorter list, but a very common one. Interest rate risk, liquidity risk, price risk, credit risk, disclosure risk, and operational risk. We're going to focus our attention really on price risk. We'll talk some about credit risk and operational risk, but we'll spend most of our time on price risk. Interest rate risk is my favorite, and we could spend quite a bit of time on interest rate risk. If we have time in this class, we'll go back to interest rate risk. But right now we're going to start with price risk, and that's where that value at risk is going to come into play. So let's talk about price risk again using this model of define, measure, mitigate. So how do we define price risk? Very, very straightforward. Price risk is that the price of an asset falls or the price of a liability rises such that you lose money. Interest rate risk is actually a special case of price risk. It's when asset values fall or liability values rise because interest rates change. So it is a special case, and we can use some of this math under interest rate risk, but it has its own special measurements. So how do we measure price risk? The most common approaches are standard deviation. That's when you're looking at total risk. Beta, as we discussed in a previous class, that's a good measure for risk when you're looking at an individual stock and you don't care about its total risk, but just its systematic risk. And the one we're going to use quite heavily in this course is value at risk, a very popular one, especially in finance. And there's three ways to calculate it: parametric, historical, and stochastic. We'll be focusing our attention on parametric, and that's using standard deviation to express and measure risk. So standard deviation is a common measure of risk, and then it's also used in value at risk under the parametric approach. Historical risk is very similar to parametric. It's just that instead of using formulas, you actually use historical periods of time. And the stochastic is similar to historical, except for you create your own series of simulations and scenarios. You create kind of your own future based on what you see today versus just using historical data. Another measure of price risk is duration and convexity, but that's really used for interest rate risk, so we may or may not be able to get back to that. So that's how we measure price risk. The most common mitigation tool for price risk is correlation. That is diversification. We try to find things that are not perfectly correlated. And then risk budgets. We'll talk about risk budgets and risk limits. That says, okay, now that we've measured our risk, this is how much we're allowed to take. We'll be doing a lot with risk budgets in this class as well. So the way this works is your measurement is how much we expect to lose. That's where value at risk comes in. And the mitigation is how much we are allowed to lose. We hope that our value at risk is less than our risk budget. If so, we're managing our risk within allowable limits. Before we get into value at risk, since we're going to be using standard deviation, I think this is a good time to stop and think about what these measures of risk mean and also what the formulas are. You should have had these formulas in your statistics class, but I want to quickly review them because especially finance majors and marketing majors and accounting majors should know these from heart. Probably others, probably almost most majors should know these from heart. The nice thing is they're very, very similar formulas. They all follow this process where the first thing you do is subtract, the next thing you do is multiply, the third thing you do is divide, and then you make some adjustments. You might I'm not sure what add is doing there, but we'll see. But we're going to just stepping through this. In standard deviation, beta, correlation, r squared, the first thing you do is subtract and multiply. So standard deviation, you take each individual item, subtract the mean, that's what I mean by x bar, and you essentially square that. That's where the subtraction comes in, and then the multiplication comes in. You subtract each item from its mean, you then square it or multiply by itself. By squaring it, all the negatives disappear, which means we only care about the distance from the mean. We don't care if we're above or below, we only care about the distance. So we're considering risk to be how far could you be from the average. That's a very important concept in finance. Finance starts with standard deviation, not saying are you losing money, but rather asking how far away can you get from what you expect, which we call the mean, the expected value. Also, the important thing with standard deviation is that it's very sensitive to outliers. Since we're squaring the differences, big differences get exaggerated, small differences almost disappear.